Hello, welcome to those who are joining. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Hello, Yankee. Hello, Ian, Jay. Welcome. I'm just giving time for people to come in. Good evening, Jayantha. Um, I don't think so, Jayantha. I could check my email. Doesn't look like it. Maybe it depends on what email you sent it to. Hello, Julie. Hmm. All right. We'll give it another minute or so. I'm feeling under the weather. Um, have been since yesterday, probably because of allergic allergies being triggered. But I don't think we'll do a full Dhammapalooza today. I probably maybe just do an hour. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to not do Dhammapalooza, but I don't think the 2 hours or the hour and a half is going to be feasible. I'll either get better or I'll die. No, I'm not gonna. Most likely, I'm not gonna die from this. There's probably a bunch of other things that I'll die from. But I had to break out the Ajahn Brahm, the Ajahn Chah on that one. All right. All right, I think we'll get started. Share the screen. All right. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Mano pubangama dhamma manosetta manomaya manasa che paduttena basativa karotiva tato nang dukam anveti chakrang va vahato padang. Mano pubangama dhamma manosetta manomaya manasa che pasanena basativa karotiva tato nang sukam anveti chaya va anapayani. Anicca vata sankhara upada vayadamino upajitva nirujjanti te sangvu pusumo sukho sabba papassa akaranang kusalassa upasampada satchitta pariyodapanang etang buddhana sasanang kanti paramang tapotittika nibbanang paramang vadanti buddha nahi pabbhajato parubhagati samanohoti parang vihetayanto anupavado anupagato patimokke cha sangbaro matanyuta jabatasming pantancha sayanasanang harichitte cha ayogo etang buddhana sasanang. English. All actions are led by the mind. Mind is their master, mind is their maker. Actors speak with a defiled state of mind, and suffering follows, as the cartwheel follows the foot of the ox. All actions are led by the mind. Mind is their master, mind is their maker. Actors speak with a pure state of mind, then happiness follows, as your shadow follows you without departing. Impermanent are all conditioned things, affected by rising and falling away. Having arisen, they then must cease. Blissful is it when they subside. Abstaining from all evil, doing what is good, cleansing one's mind, this is the teaching of all the Buddhas. Patience is the highest practice. Nibbana is supreme, say the Buddhas. A mendicant does not harm others. A recluse oppresses no one. Not insulting, not harming, restrained according to the moral code, moderating in food, dwelling in solitude, engaging in higher mental development. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. All right, friends, welcome. It is, Sam, hello. Good to see you. Welcome to, it's Monday night, so that means it's time for another Dhammapalooza, albeit probably a short one today because I'm under the weather. I'm actually feeling like I'm just about to sneeze right now. But Dhammapalooza, as always, is the festival of Dhamma on Monday nights with the Maggasekha community. And we can, from this point on, we can figure out what this hour is going to be consisted of. If you have any questions you'd like me to talk about, you can put them in the chat. If you have any topics you'd like me to talk about, you can put them in the chat. And if nothing, maybe we'll read suttas for an hour. So Julie has a good question. Is it normal that donations made under your lay name? Perhaps this is not up to date. Which one? I think the only one that requires a lay name is PayPal, maybe? All the others should be Maggasekha or Bante J. But I think PayPal requires a lay name. Yeah, this is an inevitable thing of dealing with money in the world. You know that yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, because PayPal requires I guess actual documentation, things like things like that, then they need to use your lay name. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It gets to me. All of the ones get to me. My father is my steward, but you know, the thing with me now, and the thing with lone monks is that it gets a bit more complicated with the money. Like eventually, when I start Maggasekha as an actual 501c3 and things like that, then all the donations, everything goes to that organization, and the organization supports me and any other monks that I would have with the organization. But even with that, like for instance, one of the things that surprised me, I found out one of the monks' lay names, one of the senior monks at Bhavana, their lay name, because their lay name was on the name for the one of the Bhavana vehicles. So technically, the Bhavana vehicle was owned by the lay name was on the list for the. I said, "Oh, Bhante, that's your lay name. Oh, interesting." So yeah, when it comes to legal stuff, it's your lay name is always used. It's just the way it is. The I go to the doctor or whatever. It's not like they're not listed as like Bante J. So so yeah, when it comes to legalities, lay name is pretty much out there. Yeah. Even when it comes to like donations, there's one of the other issues is like, for instance, with my father's elderly, he's retired, he's on a fixed income and things like that. um and I thought about this a lot in the beginning because I was like, you know what about taxes and stuff, like, is the IRS going to go after my dad for like when, I mean, it's not like I get a lot of donations. I mean, I get enough to be supported, but it's not like I'm getting a ton. It's like it's nowhere near like the limit where you have to like put it on your taxes and things like that. But I worried about like, that kind of being in my father's name being a little weird. And I didn't want to like have any issues, and mixing money and all kinds of stuff like that. So even like the bank stuff is actually, it's in my name and my father's name. And which is not ideal. Like if I was, a Thai forest monk and I was staying at like a buy gear or something like that, that you wouldn't have that at all. Um but for my situation right now, it works until I can, move to Colorado or wherever I end up and start Maggasekha 501c3, and then it's all handled by the organization. All right. Hello, Visaka. Ian, what is the wording for the Bante G quote on rules versus precepts? I know the gist, but not the exact wording. So he said this at a retreat, and I don't know if I was living at Bhavana already. I might have been living at Bhavana already when he said this, or it could have been. I mean, I went to Bhavana for 3 years of retreats before I moved there, so I don't know. But basically, he said there's a difference between a rule and a precept. A rule is imposed upon you by others, by government, school, your work, whatever, right? Rule is imposed upon you. A precept is something that you take on yourself. This is why I love using the word virtue, right? Because it has a different connotation in English than morality or ethics. People might hear like morality, ethics, ugh, but virtue, oh, yeah, people can be virtuous, right? It doesn't have that feeling of being imposed upon you. It has that feeling of your own goodness. This is why I like using the word virtue for sila. Virtue is a legitimate way you can translate it. It's just not not the most common way. So the difference between what is imposed upon you by the outside and what you take upon yourself. Hello, Anna. Welcome. Yep. Visaka said she had a question from this morning. How does one move from an intellectual understanding of the Dhamma to an experience of felt meaning? You have to practice the Dhamma. You have to put it into practice. Practicing anapanasati, practicing satipatthana. You honestly, sincerely, dedicatedly. That doesn't mean that you're doing it 24/7. Nobody can do that unless you're an arahant. But you are really sincerely putting the path into practice in your daily life. And then, as you're doing that, your insight and wisdom will turn the book reading, the sutta reading, and the Dhamma talks, and all these things will turn that into your wisdom, because you'll have experiences and you'll have insight that match that. This is why, I'm almost 20 years into this thing, right? In 3 years, 4 years, I'll be I'll be a Buddhist 20 years. And the over time, this is what happens. This is what develops. I don't listen to Dhamma talks. I don't just go on random, let me see, hear this Dhamma talk from this person, hear that Dhamma talk for that person. I did that for a good 12, 13 years, like 3 or 4 Dhamma talks a day almost. I listened to a lot of Dhamma. And so it's all in there. So for me, it's suttas and practice. That's what I do. Because I know already, I've already had experiences and insights on the path and understanding that what the path is. And so I know I don't need to, do this extra step anymore. I will listen to videos like if it's a monk talking about something specific to a sutta, or specific to the suttas, the early texts, etc. But this is the idea, right? This is you doing lots of listening to Dhamma talks, lots of reading suttas, da, 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 da. But if you're not fully putting it into practice, then you're not going to necessarily move past that intellectual understanding. All of the major aspects of the Dhamma, anicca, paticca samuppada, anatta, right? Impermanence, dependent origination, soullessness, all of these are experiential understandings. They cannot be understood intellectually. Just when you think you might, you don't. These are what arise with wisdom and insight on the path. So practice, practice, practice. Sincere and honest practice. Anna says, since I'm disowned and emancipated, would I need to talk to my mom and dad for the support? Not for the support. If you do sincerely go through to try to be ordained, you will need to find a place. Um, you would either need to get your parents' permission to ordain, or you need to find a monastic that would be okay ordaining you without that. They do exist. I don't agree with them. I really do believe that even if you're 50 years old, you should have your parents' permission to ordain. Um, although, you know, if I make it senior enough and people actually are crazy enough to want to ordain under me, I might change my mind depending on the situation. I don't know. But I do feel that this is something that the Buddha set down. This is very important, especially in Western context. Right? I think maybe it's not as important for a Sri Lankan person or a Thai person because those parents know they grew up in that culture. But for a Westerner, I think even if the person's an adult, you give that person like giving that parents kind of just the thought of like, oh, we matter. Oh, okay, well, and hey, maybe the parents can't be dealt with. I don't know. Maybe they won't budge. But yeah, so I that's what I would say. You would have to find a place or a preceptor who would be okay if you can't get your parents' support. Do you know the four ways to arahantship? It talks about developing samatha first and vipassana second, vice versa, or both at the same time. But what's the meaning of the fourth? Does one not need both? I'd have to look that up real quick. I suspect this is the one where it basically you end up with both. Like I know from suttas, the Buddha says whichever way you might be inclined towards one or the other, but eventually you end up with both. You cannot not have both to become awakened. Let me look it up though. 417. Third 50. Uh, no, fourth 50. I guess. Sorry. There we go. Oh well, I always forget this rarely comes up, but we can share the screen. Why don't I just share screen? Since while I'm looking at the sutta. Uh, it's a short sutta. We can read it. So have I heard at one time Venerable Ananda was staying near Kosambi in Gosita's monastery. There Ananda addressed the mendicants. Reverence, mendicants. Reverend, they replied. And Ananda said this, Reverends, all of the monks and nuns who declare in my presence that they have attained perfection did so by one or other of the four paths. What four? Take a mendicant who develops serenity before discernment, so samatha before vipassana. As they do so, the path is born in them. They cultivate, develop, and make much of it. By doing so, they give up the fetters and eliminate the underlying tendencies. Another mendicant develops discernment before serenity. As they do so, the path is born in them. They cultivate, develop, and make much of it. By doing so, they give up the fetters and eliminate the underlying tendencies. Another mendicant develops serenity and discernment in conjunction. As they do so, the path is born in them. They cultivate, develop, and make much of it. So we have a person who's more inclined towards samatha first, and then they have vipassana. The person who is inclined towards vipassana first and inclined towards samatha. The person who does both at the same time, and look at the fourth. Another mendicant's mind is seized by restlessness to realize the teaching, but there comes a time when the mind is stilled internally, settles, unifies, and becomes immersed in samadhi. There's samatha. The path is born in them. They cultivate, develop, and make much of. By doing so, they give up the fetters and eliminate the underlying tendencies. All of the monks and nuns who declare in my presence they have attained perfection did so by one of the four paths. So, another mendicant's mind is seized by restlessness to realize the teaching. So this, this could be the usually this is in conjunction with someone who's at least a stream enter. Is one of the last of the defilements, one of the last of the fetters, is restlessness. And the restlessness is not like udacha kukucha, like one of the hindrances. This is restlessness, seeing that the end is near, and we're ready to go. We're ready to finish, right? So that's what this reminds me of. This is an interesting one. I don't know if that's what this means or if this is something that's pretty obscure, to be honest with you. But either way, they have samadhi. Maybe the mind seized by restlessness to realize the teaching implies a satipatthana practice already. I don't know. This is interesting. It's interesting. There's no notes about it. Bhante Sujato doesn't have any notes in his translation. I think Ian had some wise advice for you, Anna. I agree on both counts. All right. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat, so why don't we read a sutta? You're free to put a question in the chat if you like, but let's read MN103. Is that what you think of me? So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Kusinara, in the forest of offerings. There, the Buddha addressed the mendicants. Mendicants. Venerable sir, they replied. The Buddha said this. Mendicants, is this what you think of me? The ascetic Gautama teaches the Dhamma for the sake of robes, alms, food, lodgings, or rebirth in this or that state. No, sir, we don't think that of you that way. If you don't think of me that way, then what exactly do you think of me? We think of you this way. The Buddha is compassionate and wants what's best for us. He teaches out of compassion. So the Buddha replies, so it seems you think that I teach out of compassion. In that case, each and every one of you should train in the things I have taught from my direct knowledge. This is the 37 factors of awakening. The 4 kinds of mindfulness meditation, satipatthana. The 4 right efforts, chattaro sammapadana. The 4 bases of psychic power, iddhipada panchindriya. The 4 right efforts. Chattaro iddhipada. Wait, I'm looking at the Pali. The Pali is confusing me. Why is there 4 efforts? 4. Okay. Yeah. 4 bases. Okay. I think I just went a little wacky there for a second. Yeah, 4 bases of psychic powers, iddhipada. Then panchindriyani, the 5 faculties. These are not. Okay, it's Bhante Sujato's translation that's confusing. These are not the sense faculties. Right? So this is a separate thing. The 5 indriyani that turn into the 5 balan, the 5 powers. The 7 awakening factors, bojjhanga, and the Noble Eightfold Path, Aryo Atangiko Maggo. You should train in these things in harmony, appreciate each other without quarreling. And if you want to, if you ever go on my website, you know about my mind maps that I made years ago. I made a mind map. Actually, it was the very first mind map I ever did, trying to understand this. I made a mind map of the 37 factors. So that's always a really good reference. I go back to it time to time. You should train in these things in harmony, appreciating each other without quarreling. As you do so, it may happen that 2 mendicants disagree about the teaching. Now you might think, these 2 venerables disagree on both the meaning and the phrasing. So you should approach whichever mendicant you think is most amenable and say to them, the venerables disagree on the meaning and the phrasing. But the venerables should know that this is how such disagreements on meaning and phrasing comes to be. Please don't get into a dispute about this. Then they should approach whichever mendicant they think is most amenable among those who side with the other party and say to them, the venerables disagree on the meaning and the phrasing, but the venerables should know that this is how such disagreement on the meaning and the phrasing comes to be. Please don't get into dispute about this. So you should remember what has been incorrectly memorized as incorrectly memorized, and what has been correctly memorized as correctly memorized. Remembering this, you should speak on the teaching and the training. Jay says, no, Jay, there is another sutta where the 4th one is. Yeah, there's another sutta I think that they're probably thinking of. That's a more, because it's kind of a small sutta packed into like the Anguttara or the Samyutta Nikaya. That's a very easily overlooked one. I think it's a unique one. I could be wrong, but that was an interesting thought. Yeah. I don't know why you think you're dumb, Visaka, unless you didn't type what you're. All right. So isn't this an interesting? This is remember what is correctly memorized is correct. So this is kind of like a instead of arguing over it, go back to the suttas. Of course, in the Buddhist day, it would be what's correctly memorized, right? So you have to kind of judge that by, going through maybe two or three people who have that area, that section memorized and seeing if they all have it right. So it's an interesting thing there. It's like go back to the original source, go back to the suttas to see if that can really kind of quell your disagreement. Hasn't stopped disagreement. It's still going 2,600 years later. All right. Remember this, you should speak on the teaching and the training. Now you might think, these two venerables disagree on the meaning, but agree on the phrasing. So you should approach whichever mendicants you think is most amenable and say to them. The venerables disagree on the meaning, but agree on the phrasing. But the venerables should know that this is how such a disagreement on the meaning and agreement on the phrasing comes to be. Please don't get in dispute about this. And this is another aspect of this is why you don't see monks kind of talk about the teachings of other monks that much. You don't often see monks being like, "Oh yeah, nah, they're not. Their stuff is, they have it wrong, whatever." Right? Even when they can be quite off. It's very rare for monks to kind of bash other monks or get into disputations in this regard. So that's this kind of, at least, when all monks come together, maybe at a conference or something like that, maybe there is a bit of debating, but most monks tend to just kind of do what the Buddha said and focus on their own issues, their own things, what they've done and what they haven't done, and not focus on what others have not done. It leads to lots of harmony, at least between the monastics, anyway. Please don't get into dispute about this. Then they should approach whichever mendicant they think is most amenable among those who side with the other party and say to them, the venerables disagree on the meaning but agree on the phrasing. But the venerables should know that this is how such disagreement on the meaning and agreement on the phrasing comes to be. Please don't get into a dispute about this. So you should remember what has been incorrectly memorized as incorrectly memorized, and what has been correctly memorized as correctly memorized. Remembering this, you should speak on the teaching and the training. Now you might think, these two venerables agree on the meaning but disagree on the phrasing. So you should approach whatever mendicant you think is most amenable and say to them, the venerables agree on the meaning but disagree on the phrasing. But the venerables should know that this is how such agreement on the meaning and disagreement on the phrasing comes to be. But the phrasing is a minor matter. See, that the meaning is more important. Please don't get into dispute about something so minor. Then they should approach whichever mendicant they think is most amenable among those who side with the other party and say to them, the venerables agree on the meaning but disagree on the phrasing. But the venerables should know that this is how such agreement on the meaning and disagreement on the phrasing comes to be. But the phrasing is a minor matter, so please don't get into dispute about something so minor. So you should remember what has been correctly memorized as correctly memorized. What has incorrectly been incorrectly memorized as incorrectly memorized. Remembering this, you should speak on the teaching and the training. Now you might think, these two venerables agree on both the meaning and the phrasing, so you should approach whichever mendicant you think is most amenable and say to them, the venerables agree on the meaning and the phrasing, but the venerables should know that this is how they come to agree on the meaning and the phrasing. Please don't get into a dispute over this. Then they should approach whichever mendicant they think is most amenable among those who side with the other party and say to them, the venerables agree on both the meaning and the phrasing, but the venerables should know that this is how they come to agree on the meaning and the phrasing. Please don't get into a dispute. So this is an interesting one, right? Because even agreeing can lead to disputation. Maybe not between the two, but with others. Maybe they'll team up and go after the people who have the wrong view. Please don't get into dispute about this. So you should remember what has been correctly memorized is correctly memorized. Remembering this, you should speak on the teaching and the training. As you train in harmony, appreciating each other without quarreling, one of the mendicants might commit an offense or a transgression. In such a case, you should not be in a hurry to accuse them. The individual should be examined like this. I won't be troubled, and the other individual won't be hurt, for they're not irritable and hostile. They don't hold fast to their views, but let them go easily. I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. If that's what you think, then it's appropriate to speak to them. But suppose you think, I will be troubled and the other individual will be hurt, for they're irritable and hostile. However, they don't hold fast to their views, but let them go easily. I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish in the skillful. But for the other individual to get hurt is a minor matter. It's more important that I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish in the skillful. If that's what you think, then it's appropriate to speak to them. See this? Right? So the idea is to bring them to the skillful, and there's a possibility they can do that, but it still might hurt them. In the end, it's better to bring them to the skillful. Although you have to be quite skillful to do that and not cause defensiveness and all kinds of issues. But suppose you think this. I will be troubled by the other individual, but the other individual won't be hurt, for they're not irritable and hostile. However, they hold fast to their views, refusing to let go. Nevertheless, I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. But for me to be troubled is a minor matter. It's more important that I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. If that's what you think, then it's appropriate to speak to them. But suppose you think this. I will be troubled and the other individual will get hurt, for they're irritable and hostile, and they hold fast to their views, refusing to let go. Excuse me. I'll mute it next time. Nevertheless, I can draw them from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. But for me to be troubled and the other individual to get hurt is a minor matter. It's more important that I can draw them away from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. If that's what you think, then it's appropriate to speak to them. But suppose you think this. I will be troubled and the other individual will be hurt, for they are irritable and hostile, and they hold fast to their views, refusing to let go. I cannot draw them away from the unskillful and establish them in the skillful. Don't underestimate the value of equanimity for that person. So you be equanimous. Say, well, it is what it is. I can't do anything about it. At least I can be equanimous. As you train in harmony, appreciating each other without quarreling, mutual tale-bearing might come up. So gossiping, right? With contempt for each other's views, resentful, bitter, and exasperated. In this case, you should approach whichever mendicant you think is most amenable to those who side with one party and say to them, Reverend, as we were training, mutual tale-bearing came up. If the ascetic knew about this, would he rebuke it? Answering rightly, the mendicant should say, Yes, Reverend, he would. But without giving that up, Reverend, can one realize extinguishment? Answering rightly, the mendicant should say, No, Reverend, one cannot. Then they should go approach whichever mendicant they think is most amenable among those who side with the other party and say to them, Reverend, as we were training, mutual tale-bearing came up. If the ascetic knew about this, would he rebuke it? Answering rightly, the mendicant would say, Yes, Reverend, he would. But without giving that up, Reverend, can one realize extinguishment? Answering rightly, the mendicant should say, No, Reverend, one cannot. If others should ask that mendicant, Were you the venerable who drew those mendicants away from unskillful, established them in the skillful? Answering rightly, the mendicant should say, Well, Reverends, I approached the Buddha. He taught me the Dhamma. After hearing the teaching, I explained it to those mendicants. When those mendicants heard that teaching, they were drawn away from the unskillful and established in the skillful. So this is another important thing. The person who is attempting to bring the other people to the skillful is not using their own words, is not like kind of figuring out what they're using the Buddha's Dhamma. Right? They're saying, oh, look at this sutta quote, look at this. That's very important. And that also kind of makes the other person feel like it's not you preaching to them. And it's less thinking, less, cajoling that you have to do of your own mind because you're thinking, oh, yeah, no, the Buddha is better than this at this than me. Right? This is what Bhante Ji said when he first threw me into the pit to give Dhamma talks when I was a Samanera. He said, Jayasara, they don't want to hear about from you. They want to hear from the Buddha. Right? And even to this day, even if I do bring up like something from my own life or something like that for my own practice, it's always in connection to something that the Buddha is saying, right? It's reinforcing what the Buddha says. I would be hard pressed to think of any example where I'm just totally off the cuff when I talk about things, because that's how I feel. I didn't even need Bhante Ji to say that. I have even before I moved to Bhavana, I felt that the suttas were most important. The Buddha's teaching is really the most important. I'm not awakened, so I can only do so much. All right. When those mendicants heard the teaching, they were drawn away from the unskillful and established in the skillful. That's also why I read suttas. If nobody has anything, I could give a Dhamma talk. It's true. And it would be sutta based. It's not like I'm going to just go off the top of, off the rails. But I would rather you hear from the sutta, from the Buddha's words directly. I think that's the better way to go. When those mendicants heard the teachings, they were drawn away from the unskillful and established in the skillful. Answering in this way, the mendicant doesn't glorify themselves or put others down. See? They're not, I have the wisdom, I can tell you. Or, so it's a better way of doing it, right? Doing it with the Dhamma. Much better way of doing it. They answer in line with the teaching, with no legitimate grounds for rebuke or criticism. That is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, the mendicants approved of what the Buddha said. Sadhu. Very good. Very good. All right. We're coming close to the end of the hour, and I think it might be. Uh-oh. It might be a good time to end, unless there's any final questions. We will be back for Dhammapalooza again next Monday. Next weekend is the Sutta retreat. So if you'd like to spend the weekend with me learning about how to understand the suttas, dealing with the repetition and the cultural context and all these things, then join us. Will you be traveling once Vasa is over? I mean, technically, I've traveled during the Vasa. But in November, I'm going to be spending almost all of November in Colorado. It may be possible that I might spend a week or so at Empty Cloud in October, but probably not. I'm actually being quite a support for my father. It was officially diagnosed that my mom has Alzheimer's. The official diagnosis came in, which I mean we kind of knew. And she had, like a year ago, she almost died and was very malnourished, and I think that kicked in a lot of things. And she's basically an invalid at this point. She can't walk on her own and things like that. So it's been good for my father that I've been here to kind of like to help him and things like that. And, obviously I can't do it permanently, but while I'm available, it's good to support. I know what it is to caregive for somebody who's extremely sick and weak. I remember it from, my wife, from 15 years ago. So, it's always good to support somebody who's a caregiver, especially when they're retired and it's kind of by themselves. So at least probably for most of October, I'll still be in Jersey, and November in Colorado. I have a couple events that I'm creating, doing a like a library event, for the people, and hopefully make connections with the people in Denver. And there's a few other interesting connections I've made as well for Colorado. So Colorado is starting to look up. I still have like 3 more years before my plan is to move out there, like 2025, 2026. But so far, so good. We'll see. But that's my immediate. That's pretty much just like last year. I'm spending most of the year, or at least most of the last half of the year, in New Jersey. Although last year I spent 5 months at Empty Cloud. So I can't get out of New Jersey. I keep getting stuck here. All right. I think that's good, friends. I think we're good for Dhammapalooza. Sukhi Hotu, practice well and be well. May you have a spiritually successful and peaceful practice until we meet again. Have a good week.